Welcome to the Binding of Isaac Explained. Number 4. Movement. Movement is the most important part of every game, obviously, but specifically I'm talking about player movement and player comfort. I usually pride myself on making very high quality controls for most of my games. Very important is to make it so that the movement will never seem like it's doing what you didn't intend. Most players think that the more tight the controls are, the better, but I personally like it if the controls feel like they have more weight to it, so if your character doesn't instantly stop when you press the button, I think that's usually good. And that's where we had a small disagreement, me and Edmund. He wanted tight controls, real tight. So I had to make it so Isaac stops a little faster than I would have preferred, but I still kept it so it doesn't immediately stop, so we were both happy. And we lived in a small house on a hill, until one day I realized these controls are very smooth and you can move in a circle just fine, but what's really important in this game is that you need to get around walls, and the walls are all aligned in a grid, so why don't I make it so that whenever you're going straight, right, left, down or up, it reduces the direction you're going in any other direction. So you basically go like in a square, perfectly. Originally we had a lot more walls in the rooms. Originally, the first level I made was the one with Bomberman in it, the Bomberman mini-boss. And he would basically have indestructible rocks mixed in with destructible rocks, and you needed to use your bombs to progress to the end of the level. You had to blow up the bricks. So in those levels, those controls were certainly perfect. Man, I really liked Bomberman at the time, but later on we decided to have some more open levels, so it's not the perfect controls for the game anymore, but it's still good. Sometimes there's still blocks and it'll be good that you can go that way, and it's a little arcadey anyway, so it kind of makes sense. So how does it actually work? How do you make movement, or even good movement, in an engine that doesn't have any physics in it? Okay, so the most fundamental part of every movement is velocity. Velocity in physics is distance divided by time. But in games, the velocity is how far we move each object in one frame. It's still the same principle, but in games you start out with the velocity. You say, player moves this fast. In physics, you start out knowing, oh, here's the object, it moved this distance in this time, so this is how fast it's going. Now in games we don't have to run a test to find out how fast a thing is going, we have to tell the thing how fast it's going. So velocity is what determines how we move. So how is it done? Well, basically the velocity is a vector, like position. Position is a vector where you have x and y, the same with velocity. Meaning it consists of two numbers. One number for x, one for y. Y is up and down, x is left and right. If you have both numbers, you're going diagonally. Most of the numbers could be negative, so with just two numbers you could describe an infinite number of directions. But considering the arrow keys can only be pressed or not pressed, you only have 8 directions. And standing still, I guess, if that counts. So now in order to move the object, we take the position vector and add the velocity vector, and we do that every frame. And then when the player stops pressing the button, the velocity slowly decreases to 0, or if he presses a different button, it changes. As I mentioned earlier, I also reduced the direction that you're not going in specifically fast, so whenever you're trying to take a tight corner, you'll be able to do that. If you're a programmer, you're probably gonna laugh at me for this one, but back in the day I didn't use vectors. I mean, I used X and Y, but I never used a vector class that would make things easier for me, like finding out the magnitude or getting a dot product or whatever. So I had to do all that math by myself. And that was pretty silly. Like there's one thing that's a laser, and that's pretty crazy the way I did the calculation on that one. Oh boy. Specifically the eye laser, that one could go in any direction, so it had to be pretty hard to calculate. I actually did like a giant math calculation, and I downloaded a program off the internet that allowed me to type in, well, a math equation, and then it allowed me to solve for one variable, and holy shit, I got the most complex way of getting a simple diagonal laser. Now don't be like me, I guess. always be happy to look on the internet for solutions that might already exist. Because it was also inefficient, and like half the variables cancelled out in the end, and it would have just been so simple. So anyways, one more easy thing for you to learn, or for me to explain to you, is how you change the velocity. So you have the arrow direction, you can calculate that pretty easy. You just say, if up is pressed, then y is +1. If down is pressed, y is -1. So if both buttons are pressed, they cancel out. And the same for left and right, of course. And then you have, well, the 8 directions I described earlier. Now you're just gonna divide it by the square root of 2 if you're going diagonally, because we don't want it to go, well, that much faster if you're going diagonally. It would do, because it's a vector and it says 1, 1, which is bigger than a vector that just says 0, 1 or 1, 0. So that's the square root of 2. If you remember from last episode, the Pythagoras, that's that. If you simplify it, you end up dividing it by the square root of 2 in order to make it the same distance. So that's how you calculate the wanted velocity. Now the question is, how do you mix the wanted velocity and the actual velocity together to make it move and change direction? Well, the solution is a LERP, which is a linear interpolation. Which means that at every frame we take a certain percentage of the previous vector and the next vector and we combine them. So the math for this is simple. You just multiply the current velocity by 0.8, that's 80%, and then you add to it the wanted velocity times 20%, which is 0.2. And that's how you make a self-made LERP. Only that I didn't know that it was called a LERP at the time. I just thought, I'm gonna divide this variable and add it to that variable. And if you're using Unity, you can just use the built-in LERP function. It will automatically, well, LERP a vector into another vector, or a float into a float, same thing. But I still prefer doing it manually, like dividing the first vector and then adding the other vector, because if you do it that way, you can add multiple vectors to it instead of just one into the other. And also, considering I had to do it myself and I wasn't actually using vectors yet, I had to do it for each coordinate individually. So I did x times 80% plus new x times 20%, and the same for y. And that's how I did it. Groundbreaking. Too bad the ground was already being broken by anyone else using a proper engine. Okay, so for the final part, let's talk about time. Because time is fluid. More than it should be, sadly, in this game, because in this game it's based on the frame rate. The frame rate is supposed to be 30, but when you've got a slow computer, or when I've decided to spawn way too many bullets, sorry about that, then time slows down. And little Isaac slows down. What a shame. He was planning on such great computers that would be so efficient, but sadly CPUs never got better, only GPUs. Everyone's just using GPUs for everything. Damn you, why have you forsaken old Flash games that run on CPU? Time has not been kind for Flash games in general. They're fading out the Flash player altogether on browsers. Well, I guess it won't affect Isaac, because we translated it into an executable file, of course, so it doesn't actually need Flash player to run on Steam. So anyways, how do modern games account for frame rate not affecting the time? One way of doing it is to use delta time. So what you do is you calculate how much time has passed between the last frame and this frame, and then, well, the more time has passed, the more you move the character forwards. Simple enough. But if you do that, then you could have a lag spike, and then oops, your character has gone through a wall. So what Unity does nowadays is it has, well, two different frame rates. One that you see and one that tracks your controls. So how that's done is that you can either use fixed update, where all the code you enter is calculated on a regular basis right before the physics happen, or you can use regular update, and then you can tweak all the little things that just make it visually more appealing. So the best of both worlds. And then finally, Unity has an option called Extrapolate Rigid Body, which makes it so that the objects are perfectly smooth, because if you move them in fixed intervals, Whereas the frame rate is non-fixed and based on your performance, then you would see them chugging along, that you would see them rattling around, you know? Like if you see a poorly done game, you'll see that the camera isn't always the same distance from the character. If it follows the character and then suddenly it starts chanking about, it's because they didn't extrapolate the rigid bodies, the fools. Like look in this clip of Grow Home, for example, how the feet wiggle about. You can tell that they're not extrapolated, but the camera and the rest of the player seem to be. So there you go. And yes, I know the game is very janky on purpose and your character jiggles around all the time, but that's clearly extrapolation jiggling that I'm seeing here, and I don't like it. And if you go fast enough, the camera does it as well. So what extrapolate does is it predicts where each object should be at the precise time that the frame is finally being rendered. And that way you're going to have your player character exactly the same distance from your camera, even if you're going fast and the camera has to follow behind you. And that's why it's much easier with modern engines to make games that just run really well. Well anyways, now you know about how controls work in games, and how controls are usually designed to allow the player to achieve the things that you're supposed to do in the game. Which I guess is somewhat obvious, but then the intricate way of how it's done is pretty interesting. By the way, check out this new game I'm working on called Ball Frog, where you move exclusively by rolling around and swinging from your tongue. I love making games with unique control schemes. Well, hope you're looking forward to it. It's gonna come out eventually. So, as you see, movement controls of the player determine greatly how a game is perceived and how it is played and how fun it is. And there's never too much thought put into them. Alright, so let me know what else you want to hear about in The Binding of Isaac. I've got a lot of topics that I want to talk about. I probably have 10 or maybe 20, 30 possible video ideas I can make. It's crazy, I never realized how many little details go into a game that people don't even appreciate usually, and I could totally talk about them. And then everyone will know. Everyone must know. So tell me what little things you want to hear about. Subscribe for more.